If you want to catch fish on the jig like this, then this is the video for you. In this video, I'm going to teach you guys some simple tips and some sneaky tricks to catch way more bass on the jig and gain confidence in this awesome bass catching lure. My name's Tyler, and let's talk about it. Another giant, another giant. Look at that, y'all. I can't believe what I just caught. Yes! So what is a jig? That's the age-old question, and really it has several definitions depending on what type of fishing you are doing. There are crappie jigs, there's bass jigs, there's big, giant saltwater jigs. A jig is a kind of a blanket term for some kind of fishing rig. Now, in bass fishing, when I say a jig, what bass fishermen mean is that it consists of a jig head, usually some form of a weed guard, and a skirt. That is what a bass jig is. And right here on the screen is a jig head that I'm not talking about, as well as this one, and this one. A bass jig looks like this, and this. Those are jigs, at least for the purpose of this video. Now, one thing you have to understand about the jig is that as opposed to Texas rigs, drop shots, soft plastic worms, it's going to feel a whole lot different. That's, I think, where most people get stuck fishing a jig, is that they cast it out there, they're retrieving it, and they say, you know what, forget this. I can't tell what a bite is, I can't tell what's on the bottom, I get the jig snagged a whole lot, and so I'm just gonna forget about this and continue to throw my Texas rigged worms. But I'm telling you guys, the jig, for whatever reason, gets a bigger average bite than a Texas rigged worm does and a drop shot does, and so it is 100% worth your time to put some effort into learning what a jig feels like. It might feel down there like you always have a bite, it might feel kind of mushy, and the bite might of course feel different than a Texas rig. Oftentimes Texas rig worms, you know, the fish bites it, they start swimming, you don't really feel a thud or a tick, but on the jig you normally do because it's a heavier than average weight. This here is a half-ounce jig. I'm usually not throwing a half-ounce Texas rig, and so they feel completely different on the bottom, but I'm just telling you guys, the biggest tip I can say, if you haven't found success on the jig, is to just give it more time, because eventually you'll feel what's down there a lot more than you will on a Texas rig or a drop shot, and you'll get bigger bites. Now, one thing to know about bass jigs is that they are generally grouped into one of 4 jig types. You have your standard casting jig, also called the Arky jig. You have a football jig, a swim jig, and a finesse jig. Now, these can come in multiple styles, colors, sizes, weights, metal types we'll talk about here in a second, and of course the line tie can be horizontal or vertical, but most of the time that is the 4 main bass jig styles, and they all have their own place in your tackle box. The first jig style I'm going to talk about is the Arky style, or the just standard casting jig. It's usually some form of an oval type head, either made of tungsten or lead, and can either have the line tie vertical, which is better for getting through grass, or horizontal, which is better for wood and rocks. And if you've never fished a jig, this one right here, the Outcast Tackle Juice Jig, or the Stealth or Cage Fighter, if you want to go a little more premium with your jig, these are tungsten ones. They are great jigs to try for your first ones, like I said, to gain confidence. Jig style number 2 is going to be the swim jig. Now, the head of this jig can also be made of tungsten or lead. Most often it's lead though, and it is very, very cylindrical with almost always a vertical line tie, and that is to get your jig in and around shallow grass without getting snagged on those grasses. Now, can you swim an Arky style jig, and can you hop on the bottom a swim jig style jig? Of course you can, but they are made for specific purposes, so if you're going to be swimming a jig through the water column, a swim jig is the way to go. The third style of jig is a finesse jig. This is usually a bulkier skirt material or extra non-bulky skirt material jig, usually a ball head, and comes in lighter sizes, and really the whole purpose of a finesse jig is to be what the word says, to be finesse, to fall slower in the column, to, you know, when you hop it off the bottom, it kind of, you know, sifts down in the water column. It's not so much of an aggressive hop, hop, hop. It really fits into the finesse category, and you can either throw it on a bait caster or a spinning rod, depending on the thinness of the wire. And the last style of jig, and one of my favorites, is the football jig. It has a big old football shaped head, which is perfect for pushing sediment, rocks, mud, dirt, whatever's down there on the bottom, and creating a big dust trail, allowing fish to find and eat that jig. Football jig is fantastic for water, I'd say deeper than 10 feet, 10 to 30 feet of water, and it gets some of the biggest bass of all the jig categories. Now, I made a video talking about all 4 of those styles of jigs in masterclass form, and I will leave that down in the video description because I'm sure I missed something. Now, the next tip I'm going to give you guys when it comes to fishing a jig is about your rod, reel, and line combo itself. Now, for most fishing techniques, you can get by with a medium light spinning rod, that type of deal, but for a jig, I would highly recommend bulking up your combo, because the wire on most jigs, besides one we're going to talk about, the finesse jig, that is going to be thicker than most Texas rig hooks, most spinnerbait hooks, at least the jigs that I use and I recommend. And so if you're going to get a good hookup ratio and a good landing ratio, you have to have a bulkier combo, as well as throwing this thing far. A lot of rods out there kind of max out, especially spinning rods, max out at a 1/2 ounce lure. And the 1/2 ounce is like the average jig that I throw. And so when it comes to the jigs that are 3/8, 1/2 ounce, or 5/8, I'm throwing it on a medium heavy to a heavy power rod 100% of the time. So here I have a Lew's Mock Crush 7.3 medium heavy. I love the 7.3 to get longer casting distance, and the medium heavy really helps get strong hook sets. I've got, at a minimum, 15-pound fluorocarbon line. Braided line, of course, has 0 stretch, so you'll get a really good hook set with that. But if you're fishing your jig in clear water, I would recommend going with a fluorocarbon or a monofilament line, a resin line. And I usually throw 17 or 20. I really think the difference between 15 to 17 is hardly anything, and the difference between 17 and 20 is hardly anything. And if you're fishing the jig where it belongs to be thrown, which is around underwater structure, sticks, rocks, underneath docks, you're gonna want a bulkier line, and so that's why I throw 17 to 20. I think for you pond anglers, you can get away with 15, but I would go 17 for, if you're gonna have a jig dedicated rod, I would throw 17. And then whatever the faster gear ratio, so in the 6s to 7s to 8s, anything slower than that, and I think you're not effectively fishing the jig as fast as you can. Now, I'm not saying you always fish it fast, but oftentimes I am picking apart targets that I see with my eyes, or I know that are down there based on my electronics on my boat, or just because I have experience on a certain pond. I know the brush pile's over there, so I'm gonna cast the jig, let it sink in there, hop it a few times, and move on to the next piece of structure. The jig is very versatile and very, very universal, but you've got to have the right combo to make it work. Now, one thing about the jig you must know is that they are designed to be used with a soft plastic trailer, usually some kind of craw or creature bait. It adds to the presence of the bait, and when I say presence on my channel, I'm talking about how much water it pushes, the displacement, really how big it is in the water column and lets the fish find it. And so jigs are meant to be used with trailers, but a sneaky tip I'm gonna have for you guys right now is that you really don't need more than just 2 styles of jig soft plastic trailers. The first being a finesse style craw, and the second being, I guess, a non-finesse, a very flappy, very annoying, loud style of craw. And the reason why you only need these 2 styles of craws is because they really serve the purpose of a trailer, which is not always to imitate a crawfish. A big misconception that a lot of people think out there is that they think a jig has to imitate a crawfish. Well, it's got claws as the trailer, so of course it's gotta be. Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong, because the majority of the time in your ponds and your lakes, a jig actually represents a bluegill. It imitates a perch, a sunfish, whatever you call it, around where you live. And so even though I'm throwing a technical craw, this here is the new Rage Scound Bug craw, and this is the Strike King Rage craw, the old-fashioned. Both of these actually imitate more than likely a bluegill's tail and fins, as opposed to the claws on an actual crawfish. And you can rig these craws on any style of jig, both vertical or horizontal, to keep it down in the water column or up in the water column. Like I said, you only really need these 2 styles of trailers. They come in all different kinds of colors, and you want to make sure you match the jig trailer to the actual color of your jig skirt itself. Now, the one thing I haven't talked about is the retrieval on the jig. Now, they're all going to be different, and like I said, I talked about that in masterclass form in my jig, the 4 types masterclass that I have linked below. But when it comes to most jigs, I'm going to cast it out there. Besides swim, which of course I start swimming right away, I'm going to let it sink all the way to the bottom. And the biggest sneaky tip I can give you guys is to vary your retrieve. The way you hop it, the way you drag it, the speed at which you do that. Vary it every single time you go on the water, because the fish will eventually tell you how slow or how fast they want to retrieve. So I will start with, kind of a slow hop like this, and maybe after 5 to 10 casts I don't get a bite, I'm going to start giving it a bigger hop, almost kind of like stroking it off the bottom. Let it sink. 2 bigger hops off the bottom. And after 5 or 10 casts of that not working, I may go to a slow drag of the jig off the bottom. And eventually the fish will tell you what they want, and then continue to do that retrieve the rest of the day, or at least until it stops working. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that is super crucial with the jig is, because the wire on most jigs, besides finesse jigs, is usually the thickest of any of the bass lures, you have to set the hook hard. You have to give them the business. I've been getting comments on social media for years, people saying, why are you setting the hook so hard for just a bass? Well, it's not the fish that you're setting the hook for, it is the style style of hook that you have to get into their mouth, and a really soft hook set, I'm not saying can't land them unless the hook is like ultra sharp and the hook thickness itself is really thin. If you're throwing the Outcast Tackle Juice Jig, Cage Fighter, really any Arky style flipping jigs, you have to give them the business. And as long as you do that, you know, reel down your slack, set the hook hard, and keep the tension up, you're gonna land almost every fish that bites the jig, and you're gonna gain a whole lot of confidence in this awesome technique. But also, setting the hook hard is fun. So that right there was my simple tips and tricks and a few secrets as well when it comes to fishing a jig. I have made tons of jig videos here on the channel, so make sure you search Tyler's Reel Fishing and then jig, and you'll find them all. But the one that I talked about the most, that I think is the most helpful for you if you're really trying to understand the main styles of jigs, is my 4-jig masterclass. I will leave that up here in this corner. My name's Tyler. As always, my gear is linked in the video description. If y'all could shop there, it would help out the channel a whole lot. And we'll see you guys next time right here on TRF. Bing bang.